I really mean it when I say it's one thing to have gone up with a rising empire. That's what American business did from the end of World War II to the early years of this century. But we are now in a different phase. We're in the phase that every empire in the world has seen. The downturn. After the upturn, the downturn. The Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, the Dutch Empire, the Ottoman Empire, you name it. Up, down. Down is not fun. Up is fun. The United States is now on the way down. That can end well, but you have to face it in order to deal with it that way. We're not doing that, at least not yet. And let me add another uncertainty to trouble Americans.
Professor, I really appreciate you pointing out both domestic and then external factors that contribute to the decline of the US economy that we are seeing right now. And maybe we could focus a bit more on the external factors that you mentioned. Besides the rise of the BRICS bloc, lately the two biggest foreign US debt holders, China and Japan, have been selling US treasuries. Recent estimates say that China has sold more than 300 billion with a B dollars worth of US Treasury since 2021, so just in the past 3 years. In June last month, Japan announced its sale of more than $63 billion worth of US and European government bonds. Even Belgium, a European country, started to sell its US debt holdings. Would you say that soon the US government will have fewer willing buyers of its debt? And if that is the case, doesn't it mean that the Federal Reserve will have to raise rates eventually to make its debt more appealing to foreign investors?
Yeah, this is already the case. In other words, one could before have said, I think it would be a mistake, but people said it to me, that the Chinese are reducing their holdings of US treasuries because of the deteriorating political relationship between the United States and China. And clearly that had something to do with it. But I always answered that there are very good economic reasons why China, and indeed anybody else, ought to reduce their holding of the United States Treasury. And it's very old-fashioned banking wisdom. That's why you're seeing it in Belgium. That's why you're going to see it in Great Britain, which is another one of the major holders of US government debt. You're going to see it because when a country's debt begins to go up and fast, that's when you want to begin to worry, are they borrowing at a rate they can reasonably repay? You do not want to get stuck with the obligations of a government that cannot pay. And let's remember, we live in a world where governments, past and present, have defaulted on their debts. This is not an unheard of, unknown phenomena. And if you add the number of governments who've announced they're going to do that as a way to begin to negotiate with those who hold their bonds, to reprice them, to lower the interest rate, to lengthen their maturity, the various ways one deals with debt problems, well, then you know that that's a real problem. Up until recently, the United States was the global colossus. It was growing, if not the fastest in the world, steadily. It was very, very wealthy, and it didn't have a growing debt that was out of control. The last 5-10 years are very different. We are now running annual deficits in the trillions, not in the billions, in the trillions of dollars. It has become the normal politics of both the Republican and the Democratic Party to basically disregard that. The only time the deficits and the debt come up is as a way to beat on your opponent in the election. So the Republicans attack the Democrats for doing it, and the Democrats the Republicans. Meanwhile, they both do it. Mr. Trump's greatest economic act took place in December of 2017 when he gave corporations and the rich one of the biggest tax cuts in American history, thereby worsening the debt. Mr. Biden comes in and he passes huge bills. That's what the Democrats do, pumping enormous amounts of money into the corporate sector of this country to stimulate activity, but he doesn't raise taxes to pay for it. So that will have to be paid for by debt. You see the picture. So the world is watching endless debts so that now the national debt is above the GDP for a year. That's typically a measure of, So what you're seeing in China, in Japan, in Belgium, soon in England and elsewhere, you're beginning to see people who are simply doing the age-old process of reallocating where they borrow from, so all of their debt eggs are not in one basket. That's just prudent banking. And again, the United States should face what that means. You're right. If you do this too long, and if too many countries are not only not buying your new debt, but unloading your old debt on people who might otherwise have bought your new debt, you're in trouble. And then you may have to keep your interest rates higher. And that will frustrate the problem of your currency. And then you will not be able to sell your exports because your currency is valued too high, because your interest rates are too high, a normal problem of international finance. So yeah, the United States is in that position of an accumulating quantity of problems, economic problems, partly because they have not yet understood that they have to face a changing world economy. American politicians think that their job is to be cheerleaders, to improve the feelings of the American people by not telling them the bad news, but only telling them the good news. I am going to protect jobs by putting tariffs on electric vehicles. It's easy to show economically that you're not going to protect jobs by doing that. There's no way to know in advance how many jobs you gain. You will, of course, gain some for electric vehicle producers in this country. You're protecting them. But that's going to cost you other jobs in other industries. And you don't know which of those two is bigger. You can't do it. But they say it. They act like they know. They buy economists like me who say what has to be said. But the truth, you can't fake it beyond a certain point. We are losing our economic dominance. We have been now for quite some time. And that's not going to go away. And particularly if you deny it, if you don't see how it impacts your society, if you don't take it into account. That's what I meant before, using the example of the sanctions on Russia. They failed not because the United States has no weapons, it does. Not because Russia isn't vulnerable in ways. It is. All countries are. But you're not going to get the solution you want if you are pretending rather than facing what the realities are. I really mean it when I say it's one thing to have gone up with a rising empire. That's what American business did from the end of World War II to the early years of this century. But we are now in a different phase. We're in the phase that every empire in the world has seen. The downturn. After the upturn, the downturn. The Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, the Dutch Empire, the Ottoman Empire, you name it. Up, down. Down is not fun. Up is fun. The United States is now on the way down. That can end well, but you have to face it in order to deal with it that way. We're not doing that, at least not yet. And let me add another uncertainty to trouble Americans. And that has to do with the election last week in France. Okay, we have been hearing over and over again that the world is moving to the right. We are told that the elections in Europe and the rise of, I don't know, Vladimir Putin or Viktor Orban or Narendra Modi in India and others, Xi Jinping in China, that these are all signs of a great movement to the right. Well, people begin to think like that. That becomes a kind of common sense. Yeah, but it's wrong. It misunderstands what's going on. It doesn't understand why those people are in power, why votes go the way they do. And then eventually something happens and everybody's shaken and begins to realize that the reality is not what they thought it was. The French elections this last 2 weeks are such a moment. Everybody, almost everybody, up until June 30th, the first of the two-day election sequence in France, was talking about the great struggle between the sitting president Macron and the right wing in France under Marine Le Pen. The center and the right, the center. Now the election is over. What's the number one political party that has the most seats in the Parliament of France? It's socialists. 4 different parties came together, all of whom self-define as socialists. Okay? They're the government now. They're the dominant party. Yes, they will have to negotiate. They don't have a majority on their own, which is what everybody's focusing on. Mistake. The important thing is that what you didn't pay any attention to just came away with the largest number of seats, 182 seats in a 500-person legislature. That's the socialist bloc. The right wing came in a distant third. They didn't even come in second. You talked only about them. You never talked about the left. And you didn't understand what's going on. And then the irony, will you pretend none of this happened, which is what mainstream media in the United States is mostly doing? Or will you ask the honest question, we didn't understand this really well. What are we missing? Let's figure that out so we don't make more mistakes. I mean, that is not rocket science. But you live in a time when the fear and the anxiety about going down, which is what's happening, is so frightening that you see adults act like little 2-year-old children who, when they are confronted with a dog that's barking in a frightening way, they put their hands in front of their little faces because if they can't see the dog, they imagine it isn't there. But we explain to them as they grow older, you can put your fingers there. The dog is still there. You just don't see. And they learn that. But we're dealing with a world of politicians who don't seem able to learn that.
Absolutely. And propaganda has become such an important tool of doing exactly what you just described, where people not only want to pretend that what they're actually seeing and witnessing isn't happening, but they're also told everywhere they look that something quite the opposite happens, and don't believe your eyes, they're told. And so they just don't know what to believe anymore. And I think as you pointed out, it truly is amazing to see this shift that is happening right now, and especially with elections, unexpected results for many definitely show that there is a blind spot that many of us have, that unless we start to kind of dig deeper and search alternative informational resources, we won't be able to fix that blind spot unless we truly do the research and try to understand what's going on.
And to make my point as clear as I know how, the elections in Britain that took place on the 4th of July, the same thing. You had a 14-year conservative government completely wiped out. I mean, beyond losing an election, it's not clear that the Conservative Party will survive. Its vote collapsed on it. Everybody moved to the Labor Party. I have lots of criticisms of both of those parties. It's not that, but the Labor Party is at least on some level to the left of the Conservative Party, which means that Britain went from conservative to more left. France just went from the center to the left. Hello, those are two of the most important economies in Europe. We're only left with Germany and Italy. And here's something I can assure you. I know the left-wing parties in Germany, and I know the left-wing parties in Italy. They have been given an enormous stimulation by what happened in France and England. You can be very sure they are going to follow that model and try to go in that direction. I don't know whether they will succeed or not, but I can assure you that's happening everywhere. And that now has to figure in to your consciousness. And by the way, that includes the United States. The question here in the United States is now already, don't we have a left? Suppose there were 3 or 4 left parties. Suppose people like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others like that broke away and made their own political party. In a country confronting Trump versus Biden, Bernie Sanders could be the biggest surprise of all. That was unthinkable 5 years ago. It was still quite unthinkable 2 years ago. Now I'm hearing it. It's coming in emails to me, asking me what I think about such a possibility. And I scratch my head and I realize the changing world is impacting all of these issues, even though the propaganda, as you put it, drowns out the voices that are trying to understand what's going on. By the way, it makes programs like yours where you're willing to ask these questions and to entertain different perspectives all the more important. So let me give you a compliment too.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thank you. I try to bring different perspectives in, and I try to, do as much as I can to cover a variety of perspectives. One thing that you mentioned that really stood out to me was that we're seeing the decline of an empire, figuratively speaking, right? But it is a normal cycle. And when we talk about the de-dollarization process, when we just spoke about central banks reducing their holdings of US Treasuries, is it fair to say that when the demand for the dollar declines, is it fair to say that more US dollars will effectively return back home, so to speak, to the United States, and in turn that will trigger hyperinflation potentially?
It could. Hyperinflations, when they have occurred, and I've studied them a bit in my life, almost always require a whole group of factors to come into play. You'll see these factors now and then, and they don't cause an inflation, but when they all happen together, it's like a personal crisis. You can stand it if your mother is angry at you, but if your mother is angry at you and your father and your boyfriend and your sister, it's too much, right? You can only handle so much. If there were a continuing decline in the dollar, and if you had the tariffs that the Trump political party promises to bring into being, you could then have a combination of factors, those two by themselves almost, that could produce it could produce a hyperinflation for which this country has very little preparation. It has never seen that. When I explain, I usually use as my example Germany in the early 1920s, which is one of the great examples of hyperinflation. which I know about because my mother was a child in Berlin at that time. And she told us stories about her father coming home from work in the middle of the day for lunch, carrying a bag of money. He had been paid for the first half of the day, and he was giving the bag to my grandmother to use and go shopping quickly. He went back to work. Her job was to go to the store to spend that money, because if she didn't, by the evening, she couldn't buy it. It would be worth nothing. The prices were going up, doubling every hour, so that it was impossible. That's a hyperinflation. You need a number of conditions. If we have an economic downturn and the government, in order to stimulate the economy, lowers interest rates, and nobody will lend to the United States government, and those dollars come back, and everybody borrows money to get through the hard times because interest rates have been lower, yeah, then you begin to collect the conditions which could produce a hyperinflation. But remember, the United States also has some experience, not so much with a hyperinflation, but with preventing one. And maybe I can close today with just reminding people of a piece of American economic history. When the United States entered World War II against the German Nazis and the Japanese, American economists, including some of my teachers, went to the then president, Franklin Roosevelt, and explained to him, you're about to go into a war, and we are moving resources, land, factories, iron and steel, away from producing consumer goods so that we have them available to produce the tanks and the guns and the bullets and all the other stuff to fight the war. But that means that the supply of consumer goods is going to collapse. It'll be half of what it normally is because the resources have been moved to military. If we don't do anything about that, if there's a demand for consumer goods, that won't change, but only half the supply, consumers are going to become competitors bidding up the price of scarce consumer goods. And that will mean an inflation. And that will mean only rich people can afford everything that goes up in price. And you don't want an inflation that makes poor and middle income people bitter and angry. And I use as an example, the price of milk will go up so that you will not be able to get milk for your children, but your rich neighbor will be able to buy that milk for their cat, for their pet cat, right? So this will destroy the unity that is needed to fight a war. So what they did is they said, okay, a hyperinflation is not an acceptable risk while we fight a war. So we can't have it. So what did the United States government do? Very radical. It abolished the market. It abolished the money market. It said, for the following goods, you cannot buy the goods with money. So don't bother bidding up the price, because any storekeeper who sold you a quart of milk or a pound of meat or some sugar or some coffee or any of the basics, by charging you a lot, we will arrest them and put them in jail. We are going to print ration tickets and we're going to distribute them to the population. And the only way a storekeeper can sell you anything is to let you pay with a ration ticket, a ration coupon. And the government handed them out. If you had a family with many children, you got many coupons for milk. If you were an older couple and you had no children, you got no coupons for milk. Coupons were distributed according to people's needs. There was no inflation. They prevented the hyperinflation that they could see coming. Now, again, my point. You and I can talk about the risks, including inflation, of the Republican tariff program, or of the declining use for the dollar in world affairs. But there's no plan that I'm aware of. There's no conversation. There's no movement to organize what we would do if we were in that situation, even though we did that in World War II to prevent a hyperinflation then. It tells you that we are now not facing, we are so busy denying the declining position of the United States that we are making catastrophic mistakes about our own economic future. But that means, to be honest, I can't tell you which way the wind is going to blow economically. There are too many very profound uncertainties.
Exactly. And people are not even allowed to know what might happen. They're not truly given the facts, the actual data to understand what is happening. So therefore, they can't form any expectations, and they certainly cannot plan for anything because they just don't know what is going on at the moment, as you pointed out.
It's even worse. Somebody comes along and says, "Are you suffering economically?" And they nod, "Yes, I am." And then they say, "That's because there's immigrants." Well, if you don't know enough, if no one has ever taken you through what's going on, that's as plausible as the next thing. So you begin to be angry at, 10 or 20 undocumented immigrants, and you forget that you live in a country of 330 million people that is not dependent on or importantly shaped by 10 million of the poorest people on the planet who come here, with nothing but the shirt on their back. It tells you how out of touch a society is. And that's the sad reality. But again, we're better off facing the reality than pretending that the world is like we wish it would be.
Absolutely. What really surprised me today was the news that reportedly Saudi Arabia threatened the G7 countries to get rid of all EU securities if they move forward with confiscating, or stealing is probably a more appropriate word, stealing $300 billion of Russian frozen assets. So this shows the shift in global power, where
That's
Saudi Arabia is now in the position to say something like this, right? Whereas before, it would have been unthinkable for Saudi Arabia or any other actor, especially in the region, to have this type of a conversation with G7 and the United States.
Yeah. And you're going to see more and more of that. And the only question is, what has to happen? How many acts like Saudi Arabia? How many elections like the one in France or Britain before people begin to realize? And I think that's coming. I think there will be political leaders who realize that there is a career for them being the ones who tell the truth, just like people like Trump discovered that there's a career in attacking immigrants. If the politicians figure out little late what horse to ride to get a chance to win the prize.
Absolutely. So do you feel that, the last question, do you feel that we have passed the point of no return, or is there still hope? And if so, what would you say to that?
I've always been an optimist. I'm an optimist now. I don't think anything is inevitable. I don't think we're finished. I don't. I think there are options. I'm depressed, to be honest, that our leaders are so unwilling to face these realities. But I do think that there are options. And let me close with this. Britain tried to squelch the challenger it faced. It was a colony of Britain. The United States is what it became. It was a backward, small colony of England. And then it decided it wanted its own independence. So we had a war. I'm an American. I was born in Ohio. I lived and worked here all my life. And we had a war of independence. We broke away from the British Empire. And we had a war. And the British tried to prevent it with the war. It failed for them. In 1812, they tried again, another war that failed for them. After that, they understood war is not going to hold history back. And they had to face, with lots of grumbling, the decline across the rest of the 19th century, the decline relatively of the British Empire and the emergence of the replacement American Empire. But we never went to war with them again. And to this day, I don't see any reason why the relationship between China and the BRICS on the one hand and the United States and the G7 on the other cannot sit down and work out a way to live and let live on this planet. I don't see it. It certainly is worth trying. The alternative, which ends up with nuclear war, is no real alternative. So why don't we stop wasting time, sit down, and start working out how to do this?
I agree. I think this is why it's so important to have conversations like this one and to really bring up the issues that we're facing in hopes that we will have enough people who will understand what's going on and who will join the conversation and help us bring reason back to our everyday life.
Exactly. And let me offer, if you want to in the future continue and have these conversations, I believe in them as you do. So I'm more than ready to work that out if you would be interested.
Absolutely, of course. Professor Wolff, thank you very much for such an insightful conversation. I look forward to having you on again.
And I look forward to exactly the same thing. So thank you. And again, thank you for a program that brings this stuff to the surface. That's a very important contribution.
I appreciate that.